The invitation arrived as mysteriously as the moonless night it summoned me to. I found it tucked beneath the crack of my door, its edges crisp despite the persistent dampness that clung to the late autumn air. It was a gilded thing, the sort of opulent indulgence you'd expect at a royal court, not on the doorstep of my modest apartment. There was no sender's name, only my own, inked in a calligraphy so precise it felt alive. The text inside was sparse, yet the message was clear. You are cordially invited to a midnight masquerade, Ward Manor, 1 mile past the old bridge. Saturday, the stroke of 10. No RSVP was requested, nor was there an address. But I knew Ward Manor. Everyone in town did, though no one spoke of it fondly. Perched on the edge of town like a rotting tooth, it had long since fallen into decay. Windows stared out like hollow eyes, and the air around it always seemed colder, as though it carried secrets too heavy for the land. I should have ignored it, tossed it in the trash and carried on with my life. But something about the invitation clawed at me. It felt personal, even faded, as if I'd been waiting for it without knowing. By the time Saturday rolled around, my unease had given way to an irresistible curiosity. I set out on foot, the night heavy and still. Fog curled along the road, licking at my ankles as I crossed the old bridge. The manor soon loomed before me, its silhouette sharp against the starless sky. Lights glowed faintly from within, their warmth defying the ruinous exterior. From beyond the great oak doors came the low hum of music, a haunting melody that seemed to tangle with the mist. The doors creaked open as if expecting me, revealing a grand, decrepit ballroom bathed in golden light. Candles perched in chandeliers cast flickering shadows, their wax dripping onto a floor already cracked and uneven. Guests moved like phantoms beneath the light, their masks gleaming as they turned to regard me. Each mask was elaborate, some grotesque, others regal, but all hid more than faces. They seemed alive, shifting in the flicker of candlelight, and though the guests bowed or nodded as I passed, there was something wrong in their movements, something disjointed. The air smelled faintly of wax, perfume, and something metallic that turned my stomach. A servant appeared without a sound, pressing a glass of crimson wine into my hand. "Welcome, newcomer," he whispered, his tone reverent, but his eyes darting toward my face. "The night is just beginning." I moved through the crowd, the weight of their gazes prickling at my back. Though they laughed and danced, there was something strained in their merriment, like a string pulled taut and ready to snap. I tried to focus on the details of the room, anything to ground myself. The walls, once resplendent with murals, were now flaking, their painted scenes barely visible beneath the ruin. Yet the ballroom floor, though cracked, gleamed as if freshly polished. It was almost too perfect, as though it resisted the decay of the rest of the manor. The music grew louder as I drifted deeper into the throng. A quartet of masked musicians played feverishly in a corner, their movements mechanical, almost inhuman. The violinist's mask, a snarling wolf, gleamed wetly under the light, and I could swear the mouth moved as he played. "New blood," a voice purred beside me. I turned to see a woman in an intricately feathered mask, her lips painted a vivid red. The mask seemed too close to her skin, as though it wasn't merely worn but fused. "You've come at an auspicious time," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Do you know the tradition of the Midnight Masquerade?" I shook my head, my throat too dry to respond. She leaned closer, her breath cool against my ear. "At midnight, the masks come off, and the night reveals its true face." Before I could ask what she meant, she melted back into the crowd, her laughter trailing like a ribbon of smoke. The clock chimed 11, a deep, resonant tone that silenced the room. The laughter and chatter ceased, and every masked face turned toward the towering clock at the end of the hall. Its pendulum swung in deliberate arcs, each tick an echo in the still air. When the sound faded, the host appeared. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and his mask was unlike any other, a grotesque beak of gold that gleamed even in the dimmest corners of the room. He strode to the center of the ballroom, his presence commanding. The crowd parted for him, bowing as he passed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he intoned, his voice rich and melodic, yet laced with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Tonight we celebrate the cycle of revelation. At the stroke of 12, the veil lifts, and we honor the faces beneath." The crowd murmured their approval, but their voices lacked joy. It sounded more like a ritual chant than celebration. I glanced around, searching for an exit, but the doors I'd entered through were gone, replaced by an unbroken wall. Panic surged, but I forced myself to remain still. I couldn't leave now, even if I wanted to. Something about the room, the people, the clock, it all felt alive, and I was caught in its pulse. The music resumed, slower and more somber this time, as the guests returned to their revelry. Yet their movements were different now, stiffer, more frenetic. I tried to blend in, sipping at the wine I hadn't touched. Its metallic tang clung to my tongue, bitter and cold. I was a part of this now, whether I liked it or not. Midnight was coming. The clock's pendulum marked time with an ominous rhythm. Each swing felt heavier, its tick resonating through my chest like the echo of a distant heartbeat. Around me, the revelry persisted, but the facade of joy had cracked. Guests moved in jerking, almost desperate motions, their masks no longer beautiful, but grotesque, their painted smiles curling unnaturally as though mocking their wearers. I moved toward the edge of the ballroom, hoping to escape the suffocating press of bodies. The air grew colder as I distanced myself from the crowd, the light from the chandeliers dimming. I stumbled into a shadowed alcove, its dimness wrapping around me like a shroud. A grand mirror hung on the wall, its silver frame tarnished and warped. It reflected the room, but the image was wrong. In the glass, the guests didn't wear masks. Their faces were monstrous, twisted amalgamations of human and animal, flesh and bone. The woman in the feathered mask bore the sunken eyes of a bird, her face peeling into delicate feathered layers. The wolf-faced violinist's maw had stretched into a grotesque snarl, with teeth too sharp and too numerous. And there I was, the only one still whole, my face untouched. But the longer I stared, the more I noticed something behind me, something moving in the shadows, closer with every flicker of candlelight. A hand fell on my shoulder. I spun around with a gasp, only to find a man standing there, his mask a gleaming white porcelain. Unlike the others, his movements were smooth, his voice low and measured. "You shouldn't linger here," he said, glancing toward the mirror. "They're watching." "Who's watching?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He hesitated, then leaned closer. "Those who've been here too long. They wear the masks now, but at midnight, they'll shed them. And then you'll understand." His grip on my shoulder tightened. "You should leave, but if you stay, for God's sake, don't let them see your face." Before I could ask him more, he disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the shifting mass of revelers. I staggered back into the ballroom, my heart pounding. The music was slower now, the notes discordant. The masked figures whirled in their dances, but their movements seemed more frenzied, more desperate. Some glanced at the clock, their gazes lingering on its ticking hands. 11:30. The chimes rang again, dull and oppressive. The host appeared once more, gliding through the room with the elegance of a predator. He passed me, and for a moment, his golden beak tilted in my direction, as though he knew I didn't belong. "The time draws near," he announced, his voice cutting through the eerie melody. Prepare yourselves, my friends. Midnight approaches. The crowd roared their approval, but their voices were hollow, tinged with fear. I backed away, searching for an exit, but the walls seemed to shift with every step I took. I felt the room tighten around me, the air pressing against my chest. Somewhere, a woman screamed. It was a brief, choked sound, swallowed by the music, but it lingered in my ears like a warning. I didn't want to know what had caused it. My only thought was escape. The crowd surged around me, and I was dragged into their swirling dance. The masked figures spun and laughed, their movements feverish, their masks almost alive. I felt hands on mine, pulling me this way and that, and their touch burned cold against my skin. "Take off your mask," someone whispered in my ear, their breath icy. I turned, but there was no one there. I broke free, stumbling toward the clock. Its face loomed above me, its hands crawling ever closer to 12. I glanced back at the crowd. Their masks writhed and pulsed like living things, the eye holes glowing faintly in the dim light. My pulse quickened as a horrible realization settled over me. They weren't wearing the masks were wearing them. The clock struck 12 with a booming chime that shook the very foundation of the room. The music stopped, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. I stood frozen as the masked revelers turned toward the host, their movements synchronized like marionettes. "It is time," the host intoned, his voice reverberating through the silence. He raised his arms and the room seemed to darken further. "Let us honor the unveiling." As one, the crowd reached for their masks. My breath caught as their hands trembled, reluctant, yet compelled. One by one, the masks came away, revealing the horrors beneath. The feathered woman's face was a patchwork of torn flesh and shimmering feathers, her eyes hollow pits that wept black tears. The violinist's wolfish features melded seamlessly with the human beneath, his teeth gnashing with an audible clack. Each guest transformed before my eyes, their faces defying reason, their features twisted into grotesque parodies of life. The host removed his mask last, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, a shifting void of shadows and gold that seemed to consume the light around it. His gaze fell on me, and though he had no eyes, I felt his attention burn into my very soul. "Ah," he said, his voice curling like smoke. "The unmasked one." The crowd turned toward me, their grotesque faces contorting with hunger. My hand flew to my face, realizing I was the only one still fully human, the only one untouched by whatever curse bound them. "Do you know why you were invited?" the host asked, stepping closer. "Do you understand your purpose here?" I shook my head, too terrified to speak. "You are the guest of honor," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "Every masquerade needs its sacrifice." The crowd surged toward me, their movements erratic and unnatural. I ran, dodging their grasping hands, their twisted faces leering in the flickering light. I sprinted toward the walls, pounding on them, but there were no doors, no windows, only endless stone. The air grew thick with whispers, 1,000 voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The ground beneath me began to crack, shadows pouring through the fractures like living things. The host raised his arms and the room descended into chaos. "Midnight is ours," he cried, his voice a thunderclap. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the clock's pendulum, swinging slowly, relentlessly, like the countdown to oblivion. The darkness swallowed me whole, a suffocating void that seemed to press against my skin and fill my lungs with icy dread. I couldn't tell if I was moving or falling, the sensation disorienting, as though the world had been inverted. Distantly, I heard the chiming of the clock, its tolling now warped and discordant, each note resonating like a dying echo in the endless black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the ballroom, but it wasn't the same. The chandeliers hung crooked, their flames sputtering weakly. The once polished floor was cracked and jagged, and the revelers, they were no longer human. They lurched and crawled, their twisted forms dragging across the ruined floor. Limbs bent in impossible angles, jaws gaped wider than should be natural, and their eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger. The music resumed, but it was no longer the haunting melody I had heard before. It was a cacophony of distorted notes, screeching and wailing, as though the instruments themselves were screaming. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as the revelers turned toward me in unison. Their movements were wrong, jerking, puppet-like, as though they were being dragged by unseen strings. The host stood at the center of the room, his face still a void of shifting shadow and gold. His outstretched hands seemed to command the chaos, and his voice boomed over the dissonant music. "The unmasked one remains," he declared, his tone both triumphant and mocking. "Come, let us complete the ritual." The crowd surged forward, their grotesque faces contorted with glee. I turned and ran, weaving through the crumbling remnants of the ballroom. The walls seemed to shift as I moved, warping and closing in, turning every attempt at escape into a labyrinthine nightmare. I found myself in a long hallway, lined with mirrors, their surfaces cracked and grimy. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. My face was pale, my eyes sunken and ringed with darkness. As I moved, the reflection didn't follow perfectly. Its head tilted slightly, its lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. The noise behind me made me whirl around. One of the revelers had followed, its elongated arms reaching out as it crawled along the floor. Its mask, no, its face, twisted into a hideous grin as it lunged for me. I stumbled back, crashing into a mirror, which shattered around me in a cascade of silver shards. Through the shards, I saw glimpses of the other side, a world of shifting shadows and writhing forms, all pressing against the broken surface as though eager to spill through. The reveler hissed and recoiled, its glowing eyes fixating on the shards as if afraid of them. An idea sparked, a desperate glimmer of hope. The mirrors, they weren't just reflections, they were barriers, fragments of the truth. I grabbed a jagged shard and held it up, the edge cutting into my palm. The reveler shrieked, its body convulsing as the shard caught the light. It collapsed into the ground, dissolving into a pool of darkness. I clutched the shard and ran, the whispers growing louder, the walls trembling as though the entire manor was alive and angry. The host's voice boomed behind me, carrying through the shifting halls. "You cannot escape, unmasked one. Midnight has claimed you." I burst back into the ballroom, the crowd parting as I held up the shard. The light it refracted seemed to weaken them, their forms shrinking back like shadows at dawn. The host stood unmoving, his golden beak gleaming in the fractured light. "Do you think that can save you?" he sneered, his form swelling as the shadows around him grew darker, thicker. "This is my realm. You belong to it now." The clock's pendulum swung slower, each tick a thunderous boom. Midnight wasn't over yet. I had time. Desperation fueled my movements as I hurled the shard at the clock. It struck the face, shattering the glass and silencing the pendulum mid-swing. The room erupted into chaos. The host roared, his form flickering as if torn between worlds. The revelers collapsed one by one, their bodies unraveling into wisps of smoke. The shadows receded, the walls trembling as the manor itself began to crumble. I sprinted for the doors, now visible once more. The light of dawn seeped through the cracks, beckoning me forward. Behind me, the host screamed, his voice a chorus of rage and despair. "You cannot outrun us! Midnight will find you again!" I burst through the doors into the cold morning air, collapsing onto the frost-covered ground. The manor groaned behind me, its walls folding inward as it imploded into darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space where the manor had stood. The invitation still clutched in my trembling hand, its gilded edges now dull and crumbling. I wanted to believe it was over, but the words of the host lingered in my mind. Midnight would come again, and somewhere I knew the masquerade would wait.